Hi, Stephanie from Design Plus Code. I don't know if you're on TikTok or you know this TikTok trend, but let me show it to you. So I watched a few TikToks related to this trend and it got me thinking, how do you code a Face ID authentication in SwiftUI? This will be the subject of today's video. So this is authenticating with biometrics. And this is a must-have nowadays, even more so if you're building an application with sensitive information like a financial application. You can also implement login with biometrics to speed up the login process for your users, and they won't need to always remember their credentials every time they try to access your application. So let's explore how to implement that in a SwiftUI application. But first, what are biometrics? Biometry is a term made out of two Greek words. The first one is bio, which means life, and the second one is metry, which means measure. In other words, when working with biometry, we're measuring and calculating some human characteristics like the eye, the face, or the fingerprint to authenticate a user. Biometrics authentication is some fancy words that means, in Apple's environments, authenticating the user with either Face ID or Touch ID, depending on their device and the biometrics authentication available on that device. If both Face ID and Touch ID aren't available on the device, for example, in the case of an iPod Touch 7th generation, we'll fall back to a login with credentials, so with a username and a password. For this tutorial, make sure you have Xcode 13 installed on your computer because we'll use some new features introduced in iOS 15 and it's only available in Xcode 13 and higher. We'll also be using the local authentication framework from Apple to implement the biometrics authentication process. Moreover, we'll code a few views to simulate a logged in and logged out user. So let's start. First, let's create our Xcode project. In the model that appears when you launch Xcode, click on Create a new Xcode project. In here, make sure that you're under the iOS tab and select App. Then click on Next. We'll need to choose the options for our project. So give your project a name. In my case, I will name it Authenticator Demo and select your theme, and your organization identifier is the reverse of your URL. In our case, since our website is designcode.io, we'll need to reverse it and we'll write io.designcode. Make sure the interface is SwiftUI and the language is Swift. Usually, these are the default values, so you don't need to change anything. Then, click on Next. Choose where you want to save your project and then click on Create. When creating a new project, I like to change the target device, so instead of iPod Touch, I will select an iPhone 13. We can also go to our Assets folder, and under App Icon, we can add the icon for our application. So I have my folder containing all the icons, and I'll simply need to drag and drop each icon for the specified size. For example, I have a 20 by 20 pixels icon, so I will drag and drop it into the 20 by 20 slot, and I will do the same for all the other ones. Now that I'm done adding all the icons, I can move on and start coding. The first thing we will start coding is the login view, which is this view that you can see here. This view will contain a title as well as a button that will be adapted to the biometry type available depending on the user's device model. So that would be either login with Face ID, login with Touch ID, or login with credentials. So let's go back to our Xcode project and we'll start off by creating the title because we'll reuse this component in multiple views. We'll create a component out of it. Under the Authenticator Demo folder, let's create a new group. And we'll call this group Components. I will move it right after the content view, and I will right click and create a new file. It will be a SwiftUI view, and we'll call it Title. Then click on Create. And this title will simply be a text with some modifiers added to it. So instead of Hello World, we will write Authenticator, and we'll add some boldness to it with a font of title and a foreground color of white. So since the background is white and the text is also white, we can't see the text. To fix that, we can go to the title preview and we can add a background color. Let's add a linear gradient color, which will be the same that you can see in this view. So we'll call the linear gradient, and you can see that it takes 3 arguments: colors, a start point, and an endpoint. So the colors is an array of color. Let's add blue and purple. The start point will be top leading, and the endpoint will be bottom trailing. Now you can see that we see a background color on the title, and we can now see the authenticator title. Since this is only the preview, we don't need to spread the background color on the entire screen. The next element to code is the button. So still under the components folder, let's right click and create a new file. This file will be a SwiftUI view, and we'll name this primary button. Then let's create it. This component will accept 3 arguments. The first one is an image, and it will be optional because we might not show the image on the button. And since we might not show this image, let's create a variable called showImage and set it to true. If we don't want to show the image, we'll pass the showImage argument when calling this primary button and set it to false instead. The last argument is a text, and it will be a string, and this one will be required. And you can see that now the preview is missing the argument text. So let's add an image and a text. The image will be the Face ID image from SF Symbols, and the text will be login with Face ID. Let's remove the text hello world and add an H tag instead. Inside of the H tag, let's add an if statement. So if showImage is true, we'll call the image view and pass a system name. The system name will be the image variable that we pass to this component. And you can see that we have an error because the image is optional. So let's add a fallback, and we'll add a person fill. Right below this if statement, let's show a text, and it will be the text that we passed to this component. So right now you can see our little Face ID icon with the text login with Face ID. Now on the H tag, let's add a few modifiers. We'll add some padding all around it, and we'll also add more padding horizontally. Then the background will be white and with some corner radius of 30 pixels. We'll also add some shadow with a radius of 10 pixels. So you can see that our button is now completed with some padding, corner radius, and some shadow around it. Now that we're done with the 2 components in our login view, we can now create our view. So since we'll have a few views, let's create a group called views. And we'll drag and drop the content view inside of the views folder. Now let's right click the views folder, create a new file, and this file will be a SwiftUI view, and it will be called login view. Let's remove the text hello world, and we'll add a vstack with some spacing of 40 pixels. Inside of this vstack, we will add the title, as well as a primary button. Remember that it requires some arguments, so we'll pass an image, which will be Face ID, and the text, which will be login with Face ID. So right now we cannot see the title because if you remember, we added a white foreground color. So on the vstack, let's add a frame with a max width of infinity and a max height of infinity as well. Then let's add a background color, which will be a linear gradient. And we need an array of colors, so it will be from blue to purple. The start point will be top leading, and the end point will be bottom trailing. So now we finished our login view, and we hard-coded a primary button for Face ID. However, after implementing our authentication manager later on and getting the biometric type available for the current device, we'll add a switch statement instead. Now let's call our login view in our content view. So let's go to content view, and let's remove the text hello world and add a vstack. Inside of the vstack, we'll call our login view. On the vstack, let's add a frame with a max width of infinity and a max height of infinity as well. Next, we'll call the edges ignoring safe area.all so that it covers the entire screen, and the background color will also go over this safe area at the top and at the bottom of our screen.